In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see and quiet streets hummed with the sound of chirping birds, lived Alex Carter. Alex wasn't your typical neighbor who spent weekends trimming hedges or hosting barbecues. Instead, Alex was a hard-working entrepreneur running a logistics company that had recently hit a major milestone, a contract to supply essential equipment and provisions to the National Guard. It was a dream come true for Alex, not only because it brought financial stability, but also because it gave them a sense of pride in serving their country. The business operated out of a warehouse on the outskirts of town, but Alex often worked from home, managing schedules, coordinating deliveries, and handling paperwork. With long hours spent commuting back and forth between work and home, Alex decided it was time to simplify life. They purchased a beautiful house inside a gated community, known for its strict rules and pristine environment. It seemed like the perfect place to live, safe, quiet, and close enough to both work and family. What Alex didn't realize at the time was that this decision would soon spiral into an unexpected battle. The Homeowners Association, HOA, in this community was notorious for being overly controlling. From regulating mailbox colors to dictating how many potted plants could sit on front porches, the HOA enforced every rule with military precision. At first, Alex thought nothing of it. After all, they weren't planning to paint their house neon green or throw wild parties late into the night. But what Alex failed to anticipate was that the HOA's obsession with order extended far beyond aesthetics. It included an outright ban on commercial vehicles entering the community. For most residents, this rule posed no problem. Few people needed to park delivery trucks or cargo vans in their driveways. But for Alex, whose job depended on these very vehicles, the restriction felt like stepping into a minefield. The trouble began almost immediately after moving in. One morning, one of Alex's delivery trucks arrived at the gate to pick up some supplies stored temporarily at the house. The driver, unfamiliar with the HOA's policies, assumed it would be a quick in-and-out trip. That assumption couldn't have been more wrong. As the truck approached the entrance, it was stopped by Hank, the head of HOA security. Hank was a towering figure with a clipboard perpetually glued to his hand, and he took immense pride in enforcing the HOA's rules. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of the truck, arms crossed, and declared that no commercial vehicles were allowed inside the gates without prior approval. The driver, confused and slightly intimidated, called Alex to explain the situation. When Alex arrived, they tried to reason with Hank. "Look," Alex said calmly, "this is my business. These trucks are part of my daily operations. I'm not causing any harm." But Hank wasn't interested in hearing excuses. To him, rules were absolute, regardless of circumstances. He simply shook his head and repeated the same phrase, "No exceptions." Alex walked away frustrated that day, unsure of how to handle the situation. Little did they know, this encounter was just the beginning of a much larger conflict, one that would test their patience, challenge their resolve, and ultimately reveal the true cost of living in a community governed by rigid principles. For now, though, Alex chose to let it go, hoping it was a one-time misunderstanding. But deep down, they knew this wouldn't be the last they'd hear from Hank or the HOA. The tension between Alex and the HOA didn't simmer down after that first encounter. It only grew stronger. Over the next few days, Alex tried to find ways to work around the restriction. They instructed their delivery drivers to park outside the gated community and then load or unload supplies manually. It wasn't ideal, but it seemed like the only way to avoid further conflict with Hank and the HOA. Unfortunately, this solution came with its own set of challenges. For one, the process was incredibly inefficient. Trucks idling outside the gate attracted curious stares from neighbors, who began whispering about Alex's supposed disregard for community rules. Some even complained to the HOA, fueling the already tense atmosphere. Worse still, the manual loading and unloading took up valuable time. time Alex couldn't afford to waste when deadlines loomed large. The National Guard contract required precision and punctuality, and every delay put Alex's reputation at risk. Determined to resolve the issue peacefully, Alex decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Armed with printed documents outlining their business operations and a polite demeanor, they hoped to explain the situation clearly and gain permission for limited truck access. After all, the deliveries weren't daily occurrences. They were sporadic and essential for fulfilling government contracts. Surely, Alex thought, the HOA would understand once they knew the full story. But the meeting turned out to be anything but productive. As Alex stood before the board members, trying to make their case, they were met with skepticism rather than empathy. One board member accused Alex of using their home as a warehouse, while another questioned whether the business was even legal. "We have standards to uphold here," one woman said sharply, her tone dripping with disapproval. "This isn't an industrial zone." Alex listened patiently, answering each question calmly and providing evidence to back up their claims. But no matter how reasonable Alex sounded, the board remained unmoved. Their minds were made up. Commercial vehicles were not welcome in the community, period. Hank sat silently in the corner, nodding along with the others, his arms crossed as if to signal victory. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Alex left the meeting feeling defeated yet resolute. They realized that appealing to logic alone wouldn't work. The HOA was more concerned with appearances than practicality. Still, Alex refused to let the situation derail their business. If diplomacy failed, perhaps there was another way to get through to them. What Alex didn't anticipate, however, was just how far the HOA would go to enforce their rules. A few days later, another incident occurred that pushed tensions to new heights. This time, it wasn't just one truck, it was three. An urgent request had come in from the National Guard, requiring immediate delivery of critical supplies. With no time to spare, Alex directed the convoy toward their house to gather the necessary items stored there. But as the trucks approached the gate, Hank appeared once again, blocking their path with unwavering determination. "You know the rules," Hank said firmly, standing his ground despite the imposing size of the trucks. His voice carried a hint of smugness, as though he relished being the enforcer of order. For Alex, this moment felt like the final straw. All the frustration, stress, and wasted hours boiled over into anger. "Do you even realize what these trucks are for?" Alex shot back, their tone sharp but controlled. "These aren't random deliveries. They're for the National Guard. Lives depend on this equipment getting where it needs to go." But Hank, stubborn as ever, simply shrugged. "Rules are rules," he repeated, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. As the standoff continued, Alex realized that reasoning with Hank was futile. Something drastic needed to happen, not just for the sake of the business, but to expose the absurdity of the HOA's rigid stance. In that moment, Alex knew exactly what to do. They pulled out their phone and dialed a number they'd never expected to use under these circumstances. Within minutes, reinforcements were on the way. Reinforcements that would change everything. Little did Hank or the HOA know, their refusal to budge was about to bring unexpected visitors to the neighborhood. And when those visitors arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The standoff at the gate between Alex and Hank quickly escalated into something neither of them could have predicted. As the three large delivery trucks idled outside, their engines rumbling softly, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches, sipping coffee while watching curiously, while others walked closer to get a better look. Whispers spread like wildfire. What was going on? Why were these massive trucks causing such a scene? And why did Hank, usually so unflappable, seem so determined to block them? Alex's frustration reached its peak as they tried one last time to explain the urgency of the situation. "Hank," Alex said firmly, stepping closer to him, "this isn't just some random delivery. These supplies are for the National Guard. We're talking about equipment that supports our troops. Do you understand how serious this is?" But Hank, ever the enforcer of rules, refused to back down. His face remained impassive, his arms still crossed over his chest. "I don't care who it's for," he replied bluntly, his voice carrying an air of finality. "If it's a commercial vehicle, it doesn't come in. That's the rule, and I'm not breaking it." At this point, Alex realized that arguing further would be pointless. Hank wasn't going to listen, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't see beyond the black and white letter of the HOA's regulations. To Hank, allowing the trucks inside would set a dangerous precedent, one that might unravel the strict order he'd worked so hard to maintain. But to Alex, Hank's rigid stance felt like reckless stubbornness, especially when lives could potentially hang in the balance. With no other option left, Alex stepped aside and made a phone call, a call they had hoped never to make under these circumstances. On the other end of the line was Captain Lewis, Alex's primary contact at the National Guard. After briefly explaining the situation, Alex requested backup. The captain, understanding the gravity of the delay, assured Alex that help was on the way. Within half an hour, 2 Humvees rolled up to the entrance of the gated community, their presence immediately commanding attention. Uniformed officers stepped out, their boots clicking against the pavement as they approached the scene. Neighbors who had been casually observing from afar suddenly became captivated. Children stopped playing with their toys, adults paused mid-conversation, and even Hank seemed to stiffen slightly, though he tried to mask his unease. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm yet authoritative demeanor, introduced himself. "Good morning," he said, addressing both Alex and Hank. "We received a report about a delay in delivering critical supplies meant for the National Guard. Can someone explain what's happening here?" Alex nodded gratefully and gestured toward Hank. "This gentleman," Alex explained, keeping their tone measured, "is refusing to allow our delivery trucks access to the community. Despite explaining the importance of the cargo, we've been unable to resolve the issue." The officer turned to Hank, his expression neutral but probing. "Sir, do you mind sharing why these vehicles aren't permitted entry?" he asked politely, though there was an unmistakable firmness in his voice. Hank hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the sudden involvement of uniformed personnel. Still clinging to his sense of authority, he replied, "It's against the HOA's rules. Commercial vehicles aren't allowed inside without prior approval." The officer raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the trucks before turning back to Hank. "And you're aware that these trucks carry supplies essential to national security, correct?" he asked. When Hank nodded reluctantly, the officer continued, "In situations like this, exceptions must be made. Delaying these deliveries could have serious consequences." For the first time since the conflict began, Hank looked unsure of himself. He glanced around, perhaps seeking support from the crowd of onlookers or the HOA board members who had arrived upon hearing about the commotion. But no one spoke up. Even those who had once criticized Alex now seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hank relented. With a reluctant wave of his hand, he signaled for the gates to open. The trucks rumbled forward, their drivers exchanging relieved glances as they finally gained access. Alex exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of triumph and exhaustion. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the scars of the confrontation lingered. As the Humvees pulled away and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, whispers among the residents grew louder. Many had initially sided with the HOA, believing Alex's business disrupted the community's harmony, but seeing the National Guard step in changed their perspective entirely. For the first time, they understood that the arrival of the National Guard vehicles sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, turning what had been a tense but localized dispute into a spectacle that no one could ignore. Neighbors who had previously dismissed Alex's situation as just another clash with the HOA now found themselves glued to their windows, phones in hand, capturing photos and videos of the unfolding drama. Children pointed excitedly at the Humvees, while adults whispered nervously about what this meant for their quiet community. Even Hank, usually so confident in his authority, seemed visibly shaken as he stood face to face with the uniformed officers. For Alex, the moment was surreal. They had spent weeks trying to navigate the HOA's rigid rules, hoping to find a compromise that would allow their business to coexist peacefully with the neighborhood. But instead of cooperation, they had faced resistance at every turn. Now, here they were, standing beside military vehicles in the middle of a suburban street, explaining to trained professionals why their delivery trucks had been blocked from entering. It was both vindicating and exhausting, a reminder of how far they'd been pushed. Captain Lewis, the officer leading the team, wasted no time addressing the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "we're here today because critical supplies intended for the National Guard have been delayed due to an access issue. Let me be clear, these deliveries are not optional. They support operations that keep our communities safe." His words hung heavy in the air, silencing any lingering murmurs. For many residents, it was the first time they truly understood the scope of Alex's work. Sure, they had heard vague mentions of government contracts before, but seeing the National Guard show up made it all real. Suddenly, Alex wasn't just a neighbor running a logistics company. They were someone contributing to national security. The shift in perception was palpable. Hank, however, still clung to his position, though his confidence was clearly wavering. When Captain Lewis turned to him and asked directly if he understood the stakes, Hank stammered slightly before replying. I didn't know it was this serious. I was just following the rules." The captain nodded slowly, his expression softening but still firm. "Rules are important," he agreed. "But when those rules interfere with missions that protect our country, we need to rethink them. Lives depend on these supplies reaching their destination on time." With that, Hank stepped aside, motioning for the gate to open. The delivery trucks rolled in, their drivers exchanging relieved glances as they finally gained access to Alex's property. For Alex, the relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. As they watched the trucks disappear down the street, they couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of the situation. How had it come to this? Why did it take the presence of the National Guard to convince the HOA to make an exception? As the crowd began to disperse, conversations erupted among the neighbors. Some expressed embarrassment, admitting they had underestimated Alex and judged them unfairly. Others criticized the HOA for being too inflexible, pointing out that this incident highlighted the flaws in their strict policies. A few even approached Alex directly, offering apologies or words of support. One elderly woman patted Alex on the shoulder and said, "We should have listened to you sooner. Thank you for doing what you do." But not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. A handful of residents remained defensive, arguing that the HOA's rules existed for a reason and shouldn't be bent, even for something as significant as this. These holdouts muttered under their breath, accusing Alex of using the National Guard to bully the HOA into submission. Their comments stung, reminding Alex that while progress had been made, not everyone was willing to see things differently. By the end of the day, the immediate crisis had passed, but the fallout was far from over. The HOA scrambled to issue a public statement, attempting to save face after the embarrassing showdown. They praised the National Guard's efforts and assured residents that steps would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Behind closed doors, however, tensions simmered. Board members debated whether allowing Alex's trucks inside set a dangerous precedent, while others argued that the entire ordeal proved the need for more flexible guidelines. For Alex, the experience was a turning point. While grateful for the support of the National Guard and newfound allies within the community, they couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA's initial refusal had put lives at risk. The memory of Hank blocking the trucks, oblivious to the bigger picture, lingered like a shadow. It was a stark reminder of how bureaucracy, when taken to extremes, could blind people to what really mattered. In the days following the dramatic showdown at the HOA gates, life in the neighborhood began to settle back into its usual rhythm. But nothing felt quite the same. The presence of the National Guard had left an indelible mark on the community, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable truths about their priorities and assumptions. For Alex, the aftermath was a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Relief that the immediate crisis had been resolved, frustration over how far things had escalated, and a lingering sense of unease about what the future held. The HOA scrambled to do damage control, issuing a carefully worded apology to Alex and the National Guard. In their statement, they acknowledged the importance of supporting vital national operations, while vaguely promising to review their policies regarding commercial vehicles. But for many neighbors, this response felt hollow. It wasn't just about revising rules. It was about recognizing the human element behind them. The incident had exposed a deeper flaw in the HOA's approach. Their rigid enforcement of regulations often ignored context, nuance, and common sense. As news of the confrontation spread beyond the gated community, it captured attention online. Social media lit up with discussions about the clash, with some praising Alex for standing their ground and others criticizing the HOA for being out of touch. Memes mocking Hank's unwavering dedication to the rules went viral, turning him into an unwitting symbol of bureaucratic absurdity. One popular post featured a cartoon of Hank holding his clipboard while Humvees rolled past him, captioned, "When bureaucracy meets reality." While the internet laughed, Alex found little humor in the situation. They understood that the viral attention might bring temporary validation, but it also risked painting them as antagonists in their own neighborhood. Some residents resented the spotlight, feeling embarrassed by the negative portrayal of their community. Others, however, saw the incident as a wake-up call, a chance to rethink how they treated one another and whether their obsession with rules came at the expense of compassion and understanding. Amidst the chaos, Alex received unexpected support from unlikely sources. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now approached them with kind words or small gestures of solidarity. Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher known for her love of gardening, dropped off a basket of fresh vegetables with a note that read, "Thank you for reminding us what really matters." Even Mr. Dawson, a gruff older man who rarely spoke to anyone, nodded approvingly when he passed Alex in the driveway. These moments of connection, though small, meant more to Alex than they could put into words. But not everyone was ready to embrace change. A vocal minority within the HOA remained resistant, accusing Alex of exploiting the situation to gain special treatment. At a hastily called board meeting, tempers flared as members debated how to move forward. Some argued that allowing exceptions would undermine their authority, while others insisted that failing to adapt would only lead to more conflicts like this one. Hank, still smarting from his public humiliation, sat silently through the discussion, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Despite the tension, progress was made. Albeit slowly, the HOA agreed to establish clearer guidelines for residents whose businesses require occasional truck access, ensuring that similar situations could be handled more efficiently in the future. While the new policy didn't grant unlimited freedom, it represented a step toward compromise. For Alex, it was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, they were relieved to see the HOA taking steps to address the issue. On the other, they couldn't help but wonder why it had taken such an extreme scenario to prompt action. As weeks turned into months, Alex began to reflect on the lessons learned from the ordeal. They realized that living in a tightly controlled community came with challenges they hadn't anticipated and compromises they weren't sure they wanted to make long-term. Running a logistics business from home had always been a practical solution, but after everything that had happened, it no longer seemed sustainable. The constant scrutiny, the logistical hurdles, and the emotional toll of fighting for basic rights weighed heavily on them. With this in mind, Alex started exploring alternatives. They found a nearby industrial park where they could relocate their operations, keeping their home life separate from work demands. It wasn't an easy decision. Moving the business required time, effort, and resources, but it felt like the right choice. By creating a clear boundary between their professional and personal lives, Alex hoped to avoid further clashes with the HOA and regain a sense of peace. The fallout from the HOA incident continued to ripple through the community long after the dust had settled. For Alex, life became a delicate balancing act, navigating the newfound attention, managing their business, and deciding how much energy to invest in mending fences with neighbors who had once misunderstood them. While some residents were quick to extend olive branches, others remained stubbornly entrenched in their views, creating an atmosphere of quiet tension that lingered like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. One unexpected outcome of the ordeal was the way it reshaped relationships within the community. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves now found reasons to interact more often, whether it was sharing opinions about the HOA or simply checking in on one another. Mrs. Peterson, for example, started hosting weekly tea gatherings where residents could discuss ideas for improving the neighborhood. At first, these meetings were awkward, with lingering disagreements bubbling under the surface. But over time, they fostered a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. People began to realize that living in a gated community didn't mean isolating themselves. It meant finding ways to coexist despite differences. For Alex, this shift was both heartening and frustrating. On one hand, they appreciated the efforts of those trying to bridge divides. On the other, they couldn't ignore the fact that some neighbors still viewed them as a disruptor rather than a contributor. A few even whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether Alex's decision to run a logistics business from home was selfish or inappropriate. These murmurs stung, reminding Alex that not everyone valued compromise or progress as much as they claimed. Meanwhile, the HOA faced its own reckoning. The board held several emergency meetings to address the backlash from the incident, drafting revised policies that allowed limited access for commercial vehicles under specific circumstances. They also promised greater transparency, inviting residents to participate in discussions about future rule changes. However, skepticism ran high. Many doubted whether these promises would translate into meaningful action, especially given the board's history of resistance to change. Hank, once the self-appointed enforcer of order, became a figure of ridicule among some residents. Children joked about him during playdates, mimicking his clipboard-wielding stance whenever someone mentioned the truck incident. Even adults couldn't resist poking fun at his rigid adherence to rules, though they did so quietly to avoid further conflict. For Hank, the embarrassment was palpable. He began avoiding social events and keeping his head down, clearly struggling to reclaim any semblance of authority. Despite the challenges, Alex chose to focus on moving forward. Relocating their business operations to the industrial park proved to be a wise decision, streamlining logistics and reducing friction with the HOA. It wasn't easy. Packing up equipment, securing permits, and setting up a new workspace required significant effort, but the results were worth it. With their trucks no longer needing access to the neighborhood, Alex felt a weight lift off their shoulders. For the first time in months, they could breathe without worrying about potential confrontations. Still, leaving behind the house they had hoped would be their sanctuary came with its own pang of regret. Alex had envisioned lazy weekends spent gardening, evenings chatting with neighbors, and mornings jogging along tree-lined streets. Instead, the experience had been marred by conflict and misunderstanding. Yet, as Alex stood on their porch one last time, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, they realized something important. Home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling. And while the neighborhood might not have been the haven they'd imagined, the lessons learned there had shaped them in profound ways. As days turned into weeks, Alex noticed subtle signs of improvement within the community. The HOA's revised policies seemed to ease tensions, allowing other residents with unique needs, like contractors or freelance artisans, to operate more freely. Conversations around inclusivity and flexibility became more common, signaling a slow but steady cultural shift. Even Hank softened slightly, occasionally offering polite nods or brief smiles when passing Alex in the street. Looking back, Alex knew the ordeal had changed them forever. They had entered the neighborhood hoping for peace and simplicity, but left with a deeper understanding of resilience, empathy, and the complexities of human interaction. While they wouldn't soon forget the frustration of battling bureaucracy, they also recognized the value of standing up for what mattered, even if it meant calling in reinforcements. Months after the dust had settled, Alex's life took on a new rhythm. The move to the industrial park proved to be exactly what their business needed: a dedicated space where deliveries could flow smoothly without interference. Trucks came and went at all hours, loading and unloading supplies for the National Guard and other clients with efficiency that made Alex proud. Their reputation as a reliable logistics provider only grew stronger, earning them more contracts and opportunities they hadn't anticipated. But despite the professional success, Alex often found themselves reflecting on the neighborhood they'd left behind. The gated community, once synonymous with tension and conflict, began to transform in ways no one had expected. The HOA, humbled by the public fallout of the truck incident, worked harder to rebuild trust with residents. They held open forums where people could voice concerns without fear of judgment, and slowly but surely, a culture of listening replaced the old authoritarian mindset. Even Hank, whose rigid enforcement of rules had sparked so much controversy, started showing signs of change. He attended a few community events, awkwardly mingling with neighbors and occasionally cracking small jokes, an attempt, perhaps, to repair his bruised image. For many residents, the incident served as a turning point. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about how rigid rules can sometimes overshadow compassion and common sense. Conversations that once revolved around mailbox colors or lawn maintenance now included discussions about inclusivity and flexibility. Some even credited Alex, or rather, the chaos Alex inadvertently caused, for sparking this shift. If it weren't for that whole mess, Mrs. Peterson admitted during one of her tea gatherings, we might still be stuck in our old ways. Though Alex was no longer part of the neighborhood, news of these changes reached them through former neighbors who stayed in touch. Mrs. Peterson, in particular, became a regular correspondent, sending updates via text messages and handwritten notes. "You be proud of us," she wrote in one letter. "We're learning to see each other as people first, not just rule followers." Reading those words brought a smile to Alex's face, knowing their struggle hadn't been in vain. Still, Alex refused to dwell too much on the past. Life outside the gated community offered freedoms they hadn't realized they were missing. Without the constant scrutiny of the HOA, they felt lighter, freer to focus on what truly mattered: growing their business, spending time with loved ones, and pursuing hobbies they'd neglected during the stressful months of conflict. Weekends were spent hiking nearby trails, experimenting with cooking recipes, or simply relaxing without worrying about whether someone might complain about a delivery truck idling too long. Yet, every now and then, Alex allowed themselves a moment of reflection. They thought about the lessons learned from the ordeal, the importance of standing firm when it mattered most, the value of seeking compromise without sacrificing integrity, and the courage it took to walk away when necessary. Those experiences shaped them into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. One evening, as Alex sat on the porch of their new home, watching fireflies dance in the twilight, they received an unexpected visitor. It was Mr. Dawson, the gruff older man who had lived across the street in the gated community. He carried a bottle of wine and a sheepish expression, clearly unsure of how he'd be received. "I owe you an apology," he said after a long pause. "I wasn't fair to you back then. You were doing something important, and I didn't see it." Alex smiled warmly, inviting him to sit down. Over glasses of wine, they talked about everything that had happened: the frustrations, the misunderstandings, and ultimately, the growth that followed. By the end of the night, both felt a sense of closure neither had anticipated. As weeks turned into months, Alex continued to thrive in their new chapter. The neighborhood remained a distant memory. its flaws and triumphs woven into the fabric of who they had become. Though they wouldn't trade the lessons learned, they also knew better than to let bitterness linger. Instead, they chose to look ahead, to the possibilities waiting just beyond the horizon. And so, Alex moved forward with gratitude, determination, and a quiet confidence born from weathering the storm. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.